The snow came down in heavy wind-blown sheets across the quiet plains of Montana, covering the frozen earth like a shroud. At the edge of a weather-beaten wagon stood a young woman named Clara, her belly round with the weight of the child she carried. Her lips were cracked, her hands tied in front of her with rusted chains. Just a few feet away, her older brother haggled with a rancher, his voice cold and steady as he offered Clara like a mule to be sold. 7 months along, he said with indifference. She doesn't talk back. Strong legs, won't run. The rancher eyed her with detached calculation, lifting his collar against the wind. She better not. The brother only smirked. Not anymore. Clara said nothing, but inside her, the baby moved once, then again. It wasn't the usual flutters. This was sharp, deliberate, urgent, like a knock from within, as if the child could sense danger and refuse to go quietly. Another kick made her breath catch. The world around her narrowed. Snow blurred the landscape. Cold bit into her bones, and still, the baby pressed forward, demanding something more. Clara closed her eyes and whispered so only she and the child could hear. I hear you, sweetheart. I hear you. I won't let them sell you too. Just then, as the rancher turned to mount his horse and her brother reached for the final payment, the wagon lurched over a buried root. The jolt gave her the moment she needed. Clara twisted her shoulders and slammed them into the man beside her. The chain snapped against a wooden rail. Her body dropped into the snow. She hit the ground hard, belly first, gasping as pain lanced through her side. But she didn't stay down. Her legs scrambled beneath her, finding grip in the ice. Boots thudded behind her. Voices yelled, but Clara didn't stop. She ran, knees buckling, blood already soaking through her thin dress. Wind clawed at her skin. Branches lashed her face. She ran because she had to, because there was someone inside her who wasn't for sale. Each breath burned in her throat. Her coat flapped uselessly, offering no warmth. Her hands gripped her belly protectively. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be away. The forest loomed ahead, black and jagged against the white sky. Clara plunged into it, stumbling over roots and half-hidden rocks, her vision blurred with tears and snow. Somewhere behind her, the rancher was shouting. Dogs barked. A gun may have fired, but Clara kept moving. The child inside her, quiet now, felt like a presence of strength, a reason to live. Night came fast. The cold thickened. Her pace slowed. Her knees collapsed once, then twice. She kept crawling forward through the underbrush, until finally her foot caught a patch of ice, and she tumbled down a short slope into a drift so deep it swallowed her to the waist. The impact knocked the breath from her chest. She lay still for a moment, unable to think. Her skin was burning from the cold, her breath shallow. But then another kick, faint but firm. I'm still here, she whispered hoarsely. We're still here. Somewhere above the ridge, a soft light flickered through the trees. A cabin, maybe. Clara clawed forward through the snow, dragging herself 1 inch at a time. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just moved. In a clearing not far away, a man named Eli had just lifted his axe, ready to split another log when the sound stopped him. Years alone in the woods had made him attuned to silence and its interruptions. This sound was faint, a ragged breath, a broken branch. He set the axe aside and moved into the trees, his steps quiet, precise. He found her a few minutes later, curled into the snow like a bird with a broken wing. Her hair was stiff with ice, her lips blue. The swell of her belly rose and fell just barely. Her fingers were scraped raw from crawling. Eli didn't speak. He studied her, then wordlessly. He crouched and lifted her into his arm. She weighed almost nothing. The heat had nearly left her. He tightened his grip and turned back toward his cabin. The small home sat tucked among the trees, its roof thick with snow. He kicked the door open, brought her inside, and laid her near the fire. Blankets were piled over her, a stew reheated, tea brewed. Still, she didn't wake. Eli watched over her through the night, adding wood to the flames and checking the slow rhythm of her breath. By morning, Clara stirred. Her eyes blinked open, unfocused at first. When they met his, she flinched. "You're safe," he said simply. "You're warm now?" She didn't answer, just looked around the room at the cradle in the corner, dusty but still whole. Eli noticed and hesitated before saying, "It belonged to someone I lost." Clara didn't ask. She didn't need to. Days passed, she stayed, too weak to travel, and Eli never pressed her. He didn't ask who she was running from. He didn't need to. He left supplies by her bedside. When the snowstorm came heavy one night, he brought her water and wrapped the windows tighter with burlap. She watched him from her cot, his silence, his steady hands, the way he never pitied her. And then, late one night, pain overtook her. Her time had come. She cried out, and Eli was there, kneeling beside her with boiling water and steady hands. Hours passed. She screamed, she pushed. And when the dawn broke, a child cried out, a strong, healthy girl. Clara wept then, not from pain but from something deeper. Eli wrapped the baby in one of his flannel shirts and placed her gently into her mother's arms. They didn't say much that morning. They didn't need to. Eli carved a new name onto the cradle's side and placed it beside the fire again. When Clara laid the baby down, the child looked up at her, blinking as if already remembering the journey that brought her here. Outside, snow still fell, but inside, something warm had taken root. The wind rattled through the trees like a warning as Everett raised his axe and brought it down into the frozen pine with a sharp crack. He moved methodically, his breath fogging the cold air, hands calloused and silent with the weight of years spent alone. The forest had long accepted his presence, and Everett preferred it that way, just him, the trees, and the memory of the daughter he'd lost so many winters ago. It was the sound that made him stop. Not an animal, and not the groan of old wood in the wind, and it was ragged breathing, human and near. He lowered the axe and tilted his head, listening again. Then he moved, quiet as shadow, boots crunching lightly over snow as he stepped into the trees. A trail led him there, broken branches, a streak of red against the snow, footsteps uneven and fading. He followed it without a word, his face unreadable but his pace quickening. And then he saw her, a young woman crumpled near a fallen log, her body barely more than a silhouette in the white. Her arms curled protectively around her pregnant belly, her lips blue, and her eyes fluttering closed as the wind howled through the clearing. Her dress was torn, soaked through, ice crusted in her hair. Blood had dried at her temple. Everett stood over her, jaw tight. He didn't need to know the full story. The bruises, the chains, the terror etched on her face when she stirred those spoke louder than words. He crouched down, brushing snow from her face. She opened her eyes just enough to meet his. They were glassy but pleading. Her mouth moved, and the word came out in a whisper barely audible over the wind. "Help." Everett didn't answer. He simply gathered her up in his arms, her body cold and far too light. She didn't resist. She was beyond resistance now, beyond fear. He walked with her pressed close to his chest, the heat from his coat shared as much as possible, his boots cutting a straight path back toward the cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, long before the world had gone quiet for him. The cabin sat nestled between 2 sloping ridges, hidden by evergreens and half covered in snow. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, not often. But tonight the hearth would burn. He pushed open the door with his shoulder and stepped inside, lowering her gently onto a cot near the fireplace. The room was sparse but sturdy, shelves lined with dry herbs and tools, a worn rocking chair, a cradle pushed into the corner, its surface still dusty with years of disuse. Everett moved fast but carefully, laying thick blankets over her, lighting the fire, and putting water to boil. He crushed dried leaves into a clay mug, poured in the water, and let it steep before placing it near her lips. She was shivering violently now, eyes half-lidded, but she drank with his help. He didn't speak, not even when she murmured something about her brother, about being sold. He just listened, nodding once, and returned to his work. He left her only long enough to fetch stew from the pantry. placing a bowl near her side and coaxing her to eat. Spoon by spoon, when she drifted to sleep again, he sat nearby, sharpening his blade, the rhythm slow and deliberate. His eyes never left her face. That night, the wind died down. The baby inside her stirred once, twice, and then settled as if sensing they were safe now. Everett didn't sleep. He kept the fire fed and added another blanket when her hands grew cold. He moved with a quiet urgency that came not from panic, but from knowing what was at stake. He had once watched helplessly as the flames took everything he loved. He would not watch this girl die too. By morning, her color returned. Her cheeks flushed pink from warmth instead of fever. She looked at him with clearer eyes and tried to sit up. "Where am I?" she rasped. He didn't answer immediately, just handed her the mug of tea again. When she drank, he spoke, his voice low, gravelly. "Safe." She looked around the room, taking in the space, the tools, the cradle. "Your family?" she asked. He nodded once, eyes on the fire. "Used to be." She didn't press him. Some silences don't need filling. In the days that followed, Clara, she told him her name was Clara, regained strength. She moved slowly at first, wincing with each step. But Everett never let her fall. He showed her where the stew was kept, let her take what she needed without question. He said little, but his presence was constant. She found herself watching the way he smoothed the bark from kindling, how he moved around the space like a man who had carved every inch of it with grief and purpose. He never asked why she had run. He only asked what she needed. When the storm returned 3 days later, Everett didn't hesitate. He secured the windows, checked the trap lines early, and doubled the firewood inside. He found Clara near the back wall, arms wrapped around her belly, tense with pain. "It's starting," she whispered. He moved quickly, fetching warm water, towels, herbs. His hands shook once as he laid them on her belly, but she didn't see. He caught his breath and steadied himself. Hours passed. Clara cried out, and Everett stayed beside her. He didn't flinch at the pain or the blood. When the baby came, wailing and red and perfect, Everett's eyes stung. He wrapped the child gently in a wool blanket and handed her to Clara, who collapsed into soft tears. The baby settled against her mother's chest, small fingers curling in the air. Everett watched them for a moment, then turned to the old cradle. He brushed the dust away and laid fresh linen inside. When Clara placed the baby down, she looked at him and smiled small, real and grateful. Everett didn't smile back, but his shoulders softened. That night, as snow whispered against the windows, Everett carved a small wooden flower and placed it on the edge of the cradle. Not a word was spoken, but something had shifted. The cabin, once filled with silence and shadow, now held the breath of new life. The days after the storm passed slowly, wrapped in silence and the soft crackle of firewood. Clara stayed in the corner cot, bundled beneath thick wool blankets, her body still weak but no longer trembling with fever. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw the man Eli moving through the cabin like a shadow, always working, never loud. He said little, sometimes nothing at all, but his actions spoke clearly in a way that words never could. He laid logs gently beside the hearth so she wouldn't have to reach far. He left a steaming bowl of stew near her pillow without asking if she was hungry. He folded her worn coat and placed it across a chair close enough to reach but not close enough to startle her. The first time she tried to stand, her knees buckled and he was there, catching her with arms that were strong but careful, steady but never gripping. She looked up, startled, but he only nodded once and helped her sit again, placing a thick pillow behind her back and a mug of warm broth in her hands. There were no questions, no demands for thanks, no attempt to touch her beyond what was needed, just presence, quiet, solid, constant. Each morning he rose before the sun. Clara could hear him outside chopping wood or tending to the stove. The scent of bacon or bread sometimes drifted through the air. And though her appetite came back slowly, the food was always warm and waiting. He repaired the broken shutter one afternoon while snow still fell lightly, and she watched him from the small window. The way he moved deliberately, as though every nail he hammered held back more than just the wind. One evening, as the wind howled across the ridges, Clara noticed something in the corner near the fire. A cradle, its edges worn but polished smooth as if handled often. Tiny carvings lined the sides, birds, trees, stars. She hadn't seen it before, or maybe hadn't been strong enough to notice. It sat quiet, untouched, but not forgotten. Eli caught her looking at it. For a moment, he paused. Then, without a word, he walked over, brushed the dust off its rim with his sleeve, and turned away again. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. That night, she asked his name. He didn't answer right away. Just poured water into a kettle and stirred the stew. When he finally spoke, it was so soft she almost missed it. Eli. She said nothing more. But when he brought her the bowl of food, she met his eyes and nodded. Clara. His lips tightened into something that could have been a smile but vanished too quickly to be certain. Time moved like snow falling quiet, slow, inevitable. Clara began helping where she could, folding linens, organizing the tools he left scattered on the workbench, sweeping the floor with small, careful movements so as not to strain her belly. He never asked, but he never stopped her either. One afternoon she boiled water without spilling any and set 2 mugs on the table before he came in from hauling wood. He looked down at the mugs, then at her, and gave a single nod. That was all. But for Clara, it was enough. She wasn't just a wounded guest anymore. She was part of the rhythm. At night, when the fire glowed low and the wind quieted, she would sit by the hearth and hum to the child inside her. Not full songs, just pieces, bits of lullabies remembered from long ago. Eli never interrupted, never commented, but he sat nearby with his carving knife, whittling small shapes from pine and placing them on the mantel one by one. A fox, a leaf, a small round moon. Each night, a new figure appeared. Clara began to guess what he'd make next. Sometimes she was right, sometimes she wasn't. But each morning brought a new addition, and the silence between them grew softer, less like a wall and more like a blanket. The baby kicked often now, strong, insistent flutters that made her breath catch and her hands press protectively against her belly. One morning, she woke to find a folded piece of soft flannel placed neatly beside her cot. It had been stitched recently, the thread still bright. She didn't need to ask who had made it. That afternoon, she placed it in the cradle and stood looking down at the carved wood for a long time. Eli saw her. He didn't say a word, just stepped beside her and stood in silence watching the flames together. A week later, the snow finally stopped. The sun broke through for the first time in days, casting long beams of light across the cabin floor. Clara opened the door briefly just to breathe the cold, clean air. Eli came beside her. Not too close, but near enough that she felt steadied. They looked out across the white forest together. For the first time in weeks, she smiled not because everything was fine, but because in that moment, she felt human again, seen, safe. That night, as she lowered herself into the cot, she whispered to the child in her belly, telling her about the man who didn't speak much but always knew when she was cold, or hungry, or tired. She spoke of how sometimes kindness didn't come with grand gestures or loud promises, but in the way someone folds your coat for you, or leaves the stew simmering just right, or carves a fox and places it on the mantel without saying why. She pressed her hand over her stomach and closed her eyes. Inside the cradle, the soft flannel rested neatly folded. The fire crackled beside it, and in the quiet of that night, surrounded by pine wood and snow and the gentle rhythm of someone else breathing in the next room, Clara let go of a little more fear. She slept with the sense that, though the world beyond the forest might still be cruel, here in this cabin there was room for gentleness and perhaps even love. The quiet days didn't last. As the snow began to thaw and the edges of the forest showed patches of dark, wet earth, Clara felt a tension settle across the cabin like a storm brewing beyond the trees. Eli had grown more alert, His movements, always deliberate, now carried a sharper edge. He would pause at the window longer, his eyes scanning the distant tree line. He kept his axe sharpened, not just for firewood, and cleaned the rifle she'd never seen him use. Though he said nothing, Clara knew. Someone was coming. The knock came just after dawn. A low thud, heavy against the door, followed by a voice too loud for the quiet of the woods. "Anyone home?" Clara froze, her hands resting on her swollen belly. Eli stood near the fire, unmoving. His jaw clenched. The voice called again, rough and familiar. Looking for a girl. Late teens. Pregnant. Ran off. Might have passed through here. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her heart thundered in her chest. She recognized that voice. It belonged to one of the rancher's men. Eli stepped to the door but didn't open it. "Ain't seen anyone," he said, voice low but steady. "Only thing passing through here's deer and snow." There was a pause, then boots crunching on the porch. "You live alone?" the man asked. Eli didn't answer. Clara clutched her belly tighter. A second voice joined the first. "Heard you don't talk much." "Eli, but folks say you got a soft spot for strays." The first voice laughed, mean and sharp. "Maybe we should take a look around." Eli turned to Clara. His eyes didn't panic, but there was no room for hesitation either. He pointed toward the far wall where the pantry stood. Clara stood, her legs trembling. He crossed the room, pulled aside the thick wooden shelf, and revealed a narrow opening in the floor barely large enough for a grown person. Without a word, Clara crawled in, heart racing. The space was tight, dark, and cold, with only slivers of light from the boards above. She curled herself around her stomach, trying to still her breath as the shelf slid back into place. Outside, the men argued. Eli's voice stayed level but firm. "No one comes in. You've said your piece. Now move along." A pause. Then boots stomping down the step. Clara heard one of them spit. "We'll be back. You're hiding something." The wind returned as the cabin door opened and closed again. Clara didn't move until she felt the shelf slide open once more and Eli's hand reached down. She let him pull her up. Her legs were numb, her eyes wet. He didn't speak. But the fire in his eyes was different now. Not just protective. Ready. That night. He worked long after she went to bed. He gathered snares and sharpened iron spikes, laying them out like tools in a trade he hadn't practiced in years. He dug narrow trenches around the cabin's perimeter, covered them with loose branches and snow. He coated the windows with soot and sealed the back door with a heavy beam. Clara watched him work, not out of fear but out of awe. The quiet man who carved tiny animals now moved like a soldier preparing for war. She wanted to ask how many would come back, what they'd do if they found her. But she didn't. She only said, "I don't want you hurt because of me." Eli looked up from the traps, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Too late for that," he muttered. It wasn't bitterness in his voice. It was truth. By morning, he made a decision. "We're leaving," he said. Clara blinked, startled, where he didn't answer right away, just packed a leather satchel with herbs, dried meat, and clean cloth. He helped her into her coat, wrapped her scarf tight, and pulled a fur-lined blanket around her shoulders. Then, gently, he handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a tiny carved bird. "For her," he said, nodding to her belly. They left before the sun rose. Eli led them south through the forest, his steps light and deliberate, doubling back across old hunting trails, brushing away their tracks with a pine branch tied to a stick. Clara followed as best she could, leaning on him when the path grew steep. They walked for miles, through thickets and across a shallow, frozen creek, the silence around them broken only by the call of crows and the crunch of ice beneath their boots. Just before dusk, they arrived at a small clearing. A hut sat nestled beside the river, smoke rising from a crooked chimney. It looked like something forgotten by time, with moss on the roof and herbs hanging from every window. Eli knocked twice, then stepped back. An old woman answered, her gray hair braided down her back, eyes sharp as a hawk's. She studied Clara for a long moment, then nodded and opened the door. Inside, it smelled of lavender and sage. The woman Miriam spoke little, but her hands were sure. She led Clara to a straw mattress near the fire and pressed warm poultices against her back. She offered soup with roots and bitter greens, which Clara ate slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. Eli stood in the doorway, watching every movement. Miriam looked up and said, "You can stop guarding. No one finds her here unless the river speaks." Clara slept that night without fear for the first time in weeks. In the morning, Eli was gone. A note rested on the table, carved into wood safe now. "Will return." And beside it, another figure, a tiny cradle carved from pine. The wind screamed through the trees like a warning, slamming branches against the roof as rain pounded the earth outside Miriam's cabin. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed as if it too were anxious. Clara clutched her belly, her fingers digging into the blanket beneath her. The pain had started in the afternoon, dull at first, barely more than a warning, but by nightfall, it came in waves that stole her breath and made her cry out into the dim room. Miriam moved swiftly around her, lighting more lanterns, heating water, murmuring words Clara barely heard. She was soaked in sweat, despite the cold seeping through the wood walls, and her hair clung to her forehead in wet strands. Eli arrived just after the worst of the thunder began, his coat drenched, boots muddy. One look at Clara and he knew. He didn't speak. He set down his satchel, knelt beside her, and took her hand. She gripped him tightly, her knuckles white, and for the first time, tears filled her eyes, not from fear, but from the pain of something breaking open inside her, something both terrifying and inevitable. He squeezed her hand back, steady and silent, grounding her like the weight of the mountain itself. Hours passed in groans and gasps, the storm outside echoing the labor inside. Miriam worked with quiet urgency, her eyes sharp and hands steady as she coached Clara through each contraction. "Breathe," she whispered. "Hold on, child. You're almost there." Clara cried out, her body arching with effort. Eli didn't flinch. He stayed at her side, wiping her brow, offering water, whispering her name when her breathing faltered. Then came the moment, a final guttural cry, one last push, and suddenly the sound of a newborn's cry pierced through the storm, sharp, clear, full of life. Clara collapsed back into the pillows, sobbing with relief as Miriam held up the tiny baby girl, red-faced, squirming. "Perfect. She's here," Miriam said softly, placing the child into Clara's trembling arms. "You brought her through." Clara stared down at the baby, her fingers brushing the soft skin of her daughter's cheek. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, her fists clenched, but her chest rose and fell in strong, even rhythm. "She's so small," Clara whispered, "but she feels strong." Miriam nodded. "She is like her mother." Eli remained kneeling beside them, frozen in place. Something in his face shifted, something that had been locked behind silence and grief for years. He reached out slowly, as if afraid the moment might break if he moved too quickly. Clara looked up and met his gaze. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She turned the baby toward him slightly, her meaning clear. This wasn't just her child. She had been born in his cabin, under his roof, under his protection. Eli's hand touched the baby's back, and the breath he let out sounded like a prayer long overdue. Later that night, after Clara had fallen asleep with the baby nestled in the crook of her arm, Eli sat by the fire, staring at the flames as they flickered low. Miriam brought him tea and sat beside him, saying nothing for a long time. Finally, she said, "You swore once you'd never love again." Eli didn't look at her. "I meant it." "And yet," she said, nodding toward the cradle where the baby now slept, "here you are." He glanced toward the child, wrapped in the soft flannel he'd once prepared for someone else. The cradle he dusted off out of necessity now felt full of something new, something tender and fragile. "She trusts me," he said quietly. "Clara does too." Miriam nodded. "It's a kind of love, that trust, maybe the rarest kind." The wind outside began to die down. The rain eased into a soft patter. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed warmer. Clara stirred in her sleep and instinctively reached out toward the cradle. Even while dreaming, the baby's tiny hand twitched, her mouth forming soft noises as she slept, completely unaware of the world that had tried to keep her from arriving at all. In the morning, the sky was clear. Blue stretched across the horizon, and light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, painting long golden stripes across the floorboards. Clara woke slowly, her body aching but her heart full. She looked to the cradle and saw the baby sleeping peacefully, a small wooden bird tucked beside her. Eli sat near the doorway, carving another figure from a block of pine. This one looked like a bear, strong, grounded. Clara sat up and watched him work. When he noticed her gaze, he offered a quiet smile, barely there but unmistakable. She smiled back. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. He shook his head. "You already did." She didn't ask what he meant. She felt it in the way he looked at the baby, in the way he hadn't run, in the way he had stayed beside her through every scream, through every push, through every drop of sweat and fear and fire. That evening, as they sat together near the hearth, Clara held her daughter and whispered to her. "You were born in a storm," she said, "but you brought calm with you. You brought him back to the world." Eli listened, carving in rhythm, not interrupting. When he finished, he handed Clara the figure he'd made. It was a mother bear, standing tall, her cub tucked beneath her paw. Clara held it close and nodded. "She needs a name," she said after a while. Eli was quiet for a long time before he said, "Hope." Clara looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Yes," she whispered, "Hope." And with that, the cabin, once filled with grief and ghosts, became something new, not just a shelter, not just a place to hide, but a beginning, a home. The days after the birth passed in quiet rhythm. Clara moved slowly, her body still healing, but the warmth in her eyes was undeniable. She had found something here she never thought possible again: peace. The baby, now named Hope, slept soundly in the cradle by the fire, her small hands twitching as she dreamed. Eli stayed near, silent as always, but softer now, more present. He carved small animals and laid them one by one on the mantel above the hearth. The bear he had given Clara sat proudly next to the wooden bird. The air smelled of cedar and bread, and for a while it seemed the world had finally let them be. But peace, like spring snow, never lasted long in a place like this. It was just after dawn when Clara spotted movement beyond the trees. She was feeding Hope in the rocker near the window when a dark shape passed between the trunks. Not a deer, not a shadow, a man on horseback. Then another. Her breath caught, the mug in her free hand trembling. She didn't scream. She simply looked toward the path where Eli had gone earlier with his traps. By the time he returned, her face said everything. No words were needed. He placed the snare down quietly, crossed to the window, and looked out. There, in the distance, stood two men, same ones as before, Tassaz. But this time, they weren't knocking. They were waiting, watching. Clara stood slowly, her arms protectively wrapped around Hope. "They know I'm here." Eli nodded once. They always knew. He crossed the cabin, lifted the axe from its place by the door and checked its edge with his thumb. His hands didn't shake. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were calm. There was no rage, no panic, just quiet resolve. The kind that doesn't ask for permission or forgiveness. The kind that's already decided what it's willing to protect. The men dismounted as Eli stepped outside. The cold bit into the air, but he didn't flinch. The taller one stepped forward, a rolled parchment in hand. "We've got a writ," he said, voice slick with false civility. "There's a bounty on her, property of Lyle Mercer. Says she ran off, took something that wasn't hers." Eli didn't move. "She's not property." The shorter one snorted. "You plan to fight a legal claim with an axe." Eli looked down at the weapon in his hands, then back at them. "If I have to, There was a long silence behind the cabin walls. Clara stood by the window, watching, holding Hope close. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't afraid, not like before. Not with him out there. The tall man unfolded the parchment again, as if that might change something. We don't want trouble, just the girl. Quick ride back, no blood. Eli stepped forward just once. It was enough. Then turn around. The men hesitated. They looked at the cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney, the footprints around the yard that showed 2 adults and now a third, much smaller. The shorter man narrowed his eyes. You planning to raise that baby ain't even yours. Eli didn't blink. She is now. The storm in his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried weight, like wind pressing against a door you can't hold shut. The 2 bounty hunters shifted uneasily. What they saw wasn't a lonely man defending a stranger. It wasn't some drifter holed up with a fugitive. They saw a father. A man who had already lost one family and wasn't going to lose another. That kind of man doesn't bluff. That kind of man buries people. Fine, the tall one muttered. Ain't worth the bullet. They mounted their horses. The shorter one spat into the snow. You just bought yourself a world of trouble, he hissed. Won't be the last time someone comes looking. Eli watched them turn and ride off, their shapes fading into the white edge of the forest. When he stepped back inside, Clara was waiting, tears on her cheeks. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Gratitude, awe, she whispered. You didn't have to, but Eli stopped her with a shake of his head. I did. He crossed to the cradle, where Hope now slept, and adjusted the blanket over her. His fingers brushed her cheek. Then he turned back to Clara and said softly, No one takes what's ours. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the wind had quieted again, Clara sat beside him, their shoulders touching. She didn't say much, just placed her hand over his, and he let it stay there. Outside, the snow glowed silver under the moonlight. Inside, the baby stirred once and then settled again. The danger hadn't passed forever. They both knew it. But something had shifted. Clara wasn't a runaway anymore. She wasn't someone hiding in a cabin in the woods. She was a mother now, a partner, a woman who'd found a place that wouldn't let her be taken again. And Eli, he was no longer a man mourning in solitude. He'd made a choice, not one born of obligation, but of fierce, unspoken love. He had faced the past and turned it away. He had chosen to protect the future. And in that quiet, flame-lit room, family was no longer defined by blood. It was made with each action, each sacrifice, each moment of standing firm when everything else threatened to fall. It was made the moment Eli refused to let her go. The mornings came softer now, with sunlight dripping slowly through the window slats and the scent of pine and ash lingering in the air. Clara stirred early, though the baby often woke first, babbling softly from the cradle near the hearth. That old cradle had been replaced days ago. Eli had built a new one from fresh pine, carefully sanded, sturdily jointed, and etched with tiny wildflowers along the rails. He hadn't said why he'd chosen wildflowers, but Clara understood. They were strong, simple things that thrived where others wouldn't, blooming even in poor soil. Like her, like Hope. The cabin had changed. It was still small, still tucked far from the rest of the world, but now it felt full of light, of warmth, of something she hadn't dared believe in again. Laughter came easily now, sometimes hers, sometimes his, though his was quiet and rare. He carved in the evenings by the fire, small animals and shapes, each one more detailed than the last. A rabbit with floppy ears, a squirrel curled around an acorn, a fox mid-pounce. He placed them on the shelf above the hearth, and every time Clara noticed a new one, she smiled without a word. Hope had taken to watching her father work. Yes, her father. Clara had started thinking of him that way quietly, at first in her own mind, then in whispers to the baby when they were alone. He wasn't blood. He hadn't been there from the beginning, but none of that mattered. He was the one who had stood in the storm, The one who had carved cradles, not questions. The one who had looked at her and seen not a burden, not a debt, but a life worth protecting. Now, he crouched beside the cradle, holding out a small wooden bear, its surface smooth and polished. Hope reached for it with a delighted squeal, her fingers curling around its legs. "She likes bears," Clara said, watching from the rocker. Eli chuckled under his breath, the sound low and rough like gravel under boot. "She's got good taste." Their days found a rhythm. Clara would hum lullabies as she stirred stew or gathered herbs by the cabin's edge, always with Hope tied snug against her chest. Eli hunted, chopped wood, repaired the roof, always glancing back toward the cabin to make sure it was still there, still safe. At dusk, they'd sit together on the small bench outside, watching the trees sway gently under the fading light. Hope would gurgle between them, gnawing on whatever toy she could get her hands on, while Clara leaned against his shoulder, her hand sometimes brushing his. There was no need for grand declarations, no promises spoken aloud. The promise lived in the quiet care, in the way he warmed her tea before she asked, or in the way she rubbed the tension from his shoulders when he came back stiff from the cold. It lived in the way they moved together, now seamless, sure, without hesitation. They were a family, not forged by ceremony but by fire, by hardship, by choice. One morning, Clara found a wooden plaque beside the cradle. It was small, the letters carved slow and careful Hope. Beneath it, wildflowers bloomed again, etched with such tenderness they seemed to sway. She pressed a kiss to it and whispered a thank you she knew he'd hear even if she never said it aloud. Hope was growing quickly, always moving, always watching. Her eyes tracked everything: birds outside the window, the flicker of firelight, Eli's hands as he carved. She reached for the dog, a lazy old hound who had taken a liking to sleeping beneath her cradle, and squealed with delight when its tail wagged. When she cried, Eli was often the first to reach her, lifting her with practiced gentleness and murmuring nonsense words until she settled. Clara sometimes caught him staring at the baby when he thought no one was watching. His expression would shift, part awe, part grief, but mostly something steadier. Love, not the loud kind, not the kind that fills pages in books, the kind that builds over time, quiet and strong, like roots under snow. That winter they didn't speak of the past, not hers, not his. The cabin held too much life now to echo with old ghosts. They cooked together. They laughed at the way Hope tried to gnaw on everything, including Eli's bootlaces. They carved ornaments from pine and hung them from a small tree Clara decorated with red berries. At night, they lit candles and sang soft songs, just melodies, no words, while Hope drifted to sleep with the bear clutched in one chubby hand. One evening, as the fire cracked and snow began to fall again outside, Clara reached for Eli's hand and held it. He didn't flinch. He simply laced his fingers through hers and leaned his head against hers. "She's happy," she whispered. "So am I." He nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in a rare smile. "Me too." And in that stillness, beneath the glow of fire and pine-scented air, there was no need for more. The world outside could stay far away. What they had was enough. A small home, a child with a laugh like bells, a man who carved from silence, and a woman who stitched songs from old pain. They had each other. They had hope. And that, at last, was everything. The village festival came as the first signs of spring reached the mountain pass, when the snow turned to slush and the trees hinted at green. Clara hadn't planned on going. Crowds still made her nervous, and she wasn't sure how people would look at a young woman with a baby but no wedding ring. But Eli had gently suggested it weeks earlier, carving her a hairpin shaped like a wildflower and placing it on the table without a word. She knew then it mattered to him, even if he wouldn't say so outright. Miriam came to fetch them in the early morning, wrapped in a thick shawl, her old wagon hitched to a quiet mule. She helped Clara and baby Hope climb aboard while Eli carried a basket of dried herbs and pine carvings, gifts for trade. The ride was slow, but the valley opened beautifully as they approached the village cabins scattered like seeds across the field. Smoke curling upward, Music faint in the wind. Children darted between wagons, men bartered, women laughed, and the smell of roasting meat hung in the air. Clara held Hope close, her eyes wide with memory. It had been so long since she'd seen this many people, since she had felt part of something larger than survival. At first, she kept to Eli's side, her hand brushing his coat every few steps as if to anchor herself. He didn't talk much, just nodded to those who greeted them, his quiet presence enough to keep others from prying too deeply. But word had spread. Some villagers already knew parts of their story. Fragments whispered over fences or passed between shop counters. A girl who had escaped, a baby born during a storm, a man who had once been lost in grief but had opened his home to a stranger. Most of them looked with curiosity, a few with kindness. And one of the elders, a stern woman with thick braids, invited Clara to speak during the evening fire circle where tales of survival were shared each year to honor those who'd made it through the winter. At first, Clara refused. Her voice still trembled too easily. But as the sun began to dip and lanterns were lit along the pathways, she looked at Eli holding Hope and felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was recognition of how far she had come and how much this moment mattered. She stood slowly, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked to the center of the gathering circle, where others had already begun to tell their stories. The hush that followed her steps was almost reverent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The fire flickered against her face and her words came steady, each one shaped by memory and truth. I once thought survival meant running, she began, getting away from what hurt me, escaping the hands that sold me, the men who saw me as less than human. I thought silence would protect me, that if I just kept my head down and didn't speak, maybe I'd disappear. She paused, her eyes meeting those in the crowd. Some nodded slowly. Others simply listened. I ran through a storm, barefoot and bleeding, not just because I was afraid, but because something inside me kicked so hard. It reminded me I still had a reason to fight. My daughter wasn't born yet, but she already refused to be claimed by fear. A quiet murmur passed through the listeners. Eli stood off to the side, Hope tucked in the crook of his arm. His gaze didn't waver. I found safety, Clara continued, not in walls or weapons, but in the home of a man who barely spoke. He didn't ask questions. He didn't promise anything. He just did things, left food when I couldn't stand, warmed my hands when they wouldn't stop shaking, carved toys and laid them beside a cradle I hadn't even seen. Her eyes flicked to Eli, and though he stood still, something in his expression softened, the firelight catching in his beard. People call that rescue, she said. But I don't. He didn't rescue me. He saw me, treated me like I was worth saving even when I couldn't believe it myself. That kind of care. It doesn't shout. It doesn't parade. It just shows up. Again and again. Clara reached into the satchel beside her and pulled out the small wooden bear, the first toy Eli had carved for Hope. She held it up gently. This was never just a toy. It was proof that someone believed our lives mattered, that we weren't a burden. We were family. A silence followed that was deeper than before, not hollow, but full. Then came soft clapping, first from Miriam, then the elder, then from dozens more. Clara smiled, her throat tightening. She stepped down and returned to Eli. Without hesitation, he handed her Hope and rested a hand lightly on her back. The rest of the night passed in music and food, but something had shifted. People came to them not out of pity, but with respect. They offered cloth, herbs, milk, and stories of their own. Clara listened, laughed, and even sang once just a verse while Eli stood nearby carving another animal beneath the lantern light. When they rode home under the stars, Clara leaned her head against Eli's shoulder, Hope asleep between them. You gave me more than safety, she whispered. You gave me belonging. Eli didn't speak. He simply reached over and held her hand the rest of the way. The silence between them no longer empty, but sacred. The sky outside had just begun to dim, casting long golden beams across the forest floor as the day eased into evening. The fire was already lit, casting warm flickers across the wood-paneled walls. Clara sat near the hearth, rocking slowly as the baby dozed against her shoulder. The room smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet, maybe the wild mint Miriam had left in a bundle near the windowsill. Eli moved quietly behind her, as he always did, cleaning his tools, organizing the shelves, smoothing the blankets with silent care. There was peace now. Not the kind born from certainty, but one that had been carved out of hardship and earned through each small act of kindness. The baby stirred and made a soft sound in her sleep, and Clara instinctively adjusted her hold, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She looked across the room at Eli, who had set aside the carving he'd been working on. His hands were wrapped around something small, unfinished, but shaped and smoothed with care. Without a word, he crossed the room and held it out to her. Clara took it gently and turned it in her hands. It was a small wooden blade, carved from light pine, barely the length of her palm. Along its side, etched with the careful hand of someone who rarely spoke but always meant what he did, was a single word: hope. Her breath caught, the edges of her eyes dampening as she looked down at it. She ran her finger over the carving, feeling each letter like a promise. It wasn't a weapon, not really. It was a symbol, a reminder, not of danger but of strength, the kind that didn't need to shout, the kind that was passed from one hand to another, whispered through action and trust. She looked up at Eli, his face as unreadable as ever, but his eyes resting on the baby, then on her. "She'll never have to fight the way I did," Clara said softly, her voice steady. "But if she does, she won't do it alone." Eli nodded once, then crouched beside her, his hand brushing lightly against the baby's back. They stayed like that for a while, no need to fill the silence. The fire crackled gently, and outside, a breeze moved through the trees, stirring the new buds that had begun to form. Spring was coming. Even here, Clara held the small blade against her heart for a moment, then placed it inside the cradle, tucking it beside the flannel blanket the baby loved to clutch. Hope's tiny hand reached instinctively toward it in her sleep, brushing against the carved wood. Clara smiled. "You gave her more than a name," she whispered. "You gave her something to carry." Eli stayed kneeling beside the cradle, his expression unreadable but his presence unshakable. Clara turned to him fully now, her voice low but filled with meaning. "You kept the fire for me," she said. "When I couldn't move, when I couldn't speak, you kept it burning. Even when I didn't know if I'd survive." She placed her hand over his, firm and unwavering. "Now I'll keep her for us. No matter what comes." For a long moment, he didn't move. He turned his hand over beneath hers and gave it the smallest squeeze. It was enough. In that squeeze was everything he couldn't say, every fear he'd buried, every hope he dared to hold again. He looked at the baby, then at the small wooden blade, and finally at Clara. She saw it in his eyes, not just love but belief in her, in the child, in the family they had built from ruin. Later that night, after the baby had been fed and laid gently back into the cradle, Clara stood at the doorway of the cabin, wrapped in Eli's old coat. The stars above glittered like silver dust, and the wind was soft against her face. She heard his footsteps behind her but didn't turn. He stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Eventually, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a ribbon faded blue, one of the few things she'd kept from the past that didn't hurt to remember. She tied it gently around the hilt of the wooden blade, now resting beside their sleeping daughter, a symbol of where she'd been and where they were going. When she returned inside, Eli had already set the kettle on the stove and placed 2 mugs on the table. He handed her one, and she took it with a soft smile. They sat together side by side, their fingers brushing as they sipped. The fire burned low but steady. Outside, the forest held its breath. Inside, a family grew not just in number but in spirit. And in the quiet of that moment, A wooden blade with a single carved word rested near the heartbeat of something new, something lasting. Hope, not just for the child who bore the name, but for the man who carved it, and for the woman who would never again walk alone. The snow returned one evening as if the sky had decided to soften everything it touched. It did not fall with the bitter bite of winter storms, but drifted gently, layering the roof of the small cabin in white, settling over the fields and trees in quiet grace. Inside, the warmth of the fire filled every corner of the room, its glow flickering across the wooden beams and the cradle by the hearth. Clara sat in the old rocking chair, her body swaying slightly as she hummed a low tune to the baby cradled in her arms. Hope's eyes were half closed, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling as if trying to hold on to the sound of her mother's voice. The world outside could have vanished into white, and they wouldn't have noticed. Everything that mattered was here. In this room, Eli sat at the workbench, carving another toy from a block of pine. His movements were slow but precise, the sound of the blade rasping softly against wood blending with the crackle of the fire. He didn't look up as he worked, but he didn't need to. Every so often, he glanced from the corner of his eye to where Clara rocked, and in those moments, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding that no words could carry. He had spent years in this cabin with only silence and ghosts for company, and now even the silence felt alive, filled with warmth and breath and laughter that came in small, surprising bursts. The cabin had changed since Clara had first stepped through its door, half frozen and barely clinging to life. It was no longer just a place to endure the cold or hide from the past. There were dried flowers hanging near the window now, a row of tiny carved animals lined along the shelf, and a quilt Clara had stitched by hand folded neatly at the foot of the bed. On the table rested a jar of honey given by a neighbor, a gesture of kindness that would have once felt foreign to Eli but now felt like part of a life he had almost forgotten he wanted. Hope stirred, letting out a soft cry that Clara quieted with a gentle touch and a whispered lullaby. The sound of her voice seemed to reach something deep inside Eli. He paused, the toy in his hand half finished, and turned to watch them. The sight still struck him as something unreal, a woman who trusted him, a child who looked at him as though he was the entire world. He had spent so long believing he wasn't meant for love or family, that all of it had burned away with his past. But here it was again, blooming like wildflowers in spring. Without thinking, he stood and walked over to them, crouching beside Clara's chair. "She's growing," he said, his voice low and rough, as though unused to carrying such gentle words. Clara smiled down at the baby. "Every day," she whispered. She reached for his hand, placing it on the baby's small chest where her heart beat fast and strong. Eli's thumb brushed over her blanket, and for a moment all he could do was feel her warmth, her life, the weight of what they had built together without even realizing it. Later, when Hope was asleep in the cradle, Clara and Eli sat side by side on the bench near the fire. He had brought over the carving he had finished, a tiny deer with slender legs and careful etchings along its back. Clara traced the lines of it with her fingers, her eyes soft. "You've given her a world already," she said quietly. He shook his head. "We've given her one." She leaned against his shoulder, and for a while they didn't speak. There was no need. Outside, the snow thickened, falling in slow, steady flakes. Through the window, the forest looked like a painting, every branch dusted white, every shadow softened. Clara thought of how much had changed since that first night, how every step from pain to peace had been marked not by grand gestures but by simple moments like this. Eli sharpening a knife so she wouldn't struggle, her mending his shirt when the sleeve tore, both of them rising in the middle of the night to soothe Hope's cries. This was what love looked like, unspoken, patient, steady as the fire that burned between them. Before long, Eli rose and placed another log on the fire. The flames flared, warming the room, and he glanced at Clara. "You should rest," he murmured. "I'll finish here." She shook her head, smiling. I like watching you work." So she stayed, her eyes following the slow, sure movements of his hands as he picked up another piece of wood. He started carving again, the blade glinting in the firelight. Each curl of wood that fell to the floor seemed to carry a piece of his story. A man who had once carved just to fill the silence, but now carved to give shape to something greater than himself. The night deepened. The wind outside grew softer, carrying the sound of snow sliding gently from the branches. Hope let out a contented sigh in her sleep, and Clara stood to check on her, adjusting the blanket and tucking the small wooden blade. Still tied with a faded blue ribbon, closer to her side, that simple piece of wood had become a promise, a reminder of what they had endured and what they would protect together. Clara returned to the bench, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea Eli had set out for her. They sat together, watching the fire, their shoulders touching. For the first time in years, Eli felt no weight on his chest, no restless ache in his bones, just peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop running from the past and start living for what's right in front of you. As the snow fell through the night, the cabin stood like a quiet island of warmth in a world of white. The flames danced in the hearth, the baby dreamed in her cradle, and two people who had once been lost now sat together, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. Healing had found them here, in this small place carved out of wood and silence and love. And as the last piece of Eli's carving took shape in his hands, Clara leaned her head against his arm and closed her eyes, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they had already built something strong enough to last. This story offers a deeply touching reminder that healing and love often come quietly, through small acts of kindness rather than grand gestures. For older adults, many of whom have experienced loss, hardship, or deep loneliness, it speaks to the power of resilience and the unexpected ways life can still offer connection. The central message is that even after great pain, it's never too late to rebuild a sense of home, family, or purpose. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It's earned through gentle consistency, like a warm fire kept burning or a hand held in silence. The story encourages us to look beyond words and focus on what truly matters, being present for one another, creating safe spaces, and recognizing love in action. As we age, we often reflect on what we leave behind. This story reminds us that the legacy of love, quiet protection, and simple devotion can be among the most powerful gifts we offer, whether it's welcoming others into our lives or allowing ourselves to be cared for. There's hope and peace in letting love take root even in life's later seasons.